You didn't hear a voice, but something inside you quietly stood up and listened. There are moments in life when nothing dramatic happens on the outside, yet everything subtly rearranges on the inside. No lightning bolt, no announcement, just a soft inner shift, like furniture being moved in the dark. You don't know exactly what changed, but you know you're not standing where you were a moment ago. That is the kind of moment we are entering right now. If you are here, listening to these words, I'm not asking you to believe anything. Belief belongs to the mind, and the mind has been wrong before. I'm inviting you to notice, to feel, to recognize, because what is happening here is not persuasion, it is resonance. A frequency does not argue its way into your life. It arrives, and something in you either recognizes it or it doesn't. And when it does, the recognition is quiet. The idea of the 144,000 has been misunderstood for a very long time. People tried to turn it into a number, a hierarchy, a spiritual ranking system. But it was never about how many. It was always about how stable. It describes a state of consciousness, capable of remaining coherent, while everything else destabilizes. Not louder, not higher, just steady. And if you feel that you've been moving toward this understanding your entire life, even when you didn't have language for it, then you're not starting something new. You're remembering something old, something familiar, something that has been walking with you through every season, including the ones that felt like detours. There is a reason your path didn't look like other people's paths. You noticed it early. While others seemed comfortable fitting into systems, beliefs, and identities that never quite fit you, something in your body resisted, not rebelliously, quietly, like trying to wear a coat that looks fine on others but feels wrong on your skin. That resistance was not arrogance. It was discernment before you knew the word for it. You were never meant to be carried by external structures. You were being trained to carry yourself. And that training rarely looks glamorous. It often looks like waiting, like being misunderstood, like watching others move forward while you remain still, wondering if you missed a signal somewhere along the way. But stillness is not absence. Stillness is instruction without noise. Think of a river that has spent years pushing itself upstream, straining against the current because it believed effort was the same as movement. And then one day, without fanfare, it stops forcing. The river doesn't disappear. It simply turns and begins flowing in the direction it was always meant to go. The effort dissolves. The movement becomes natural. That is what alignment feels like in the nervous system. Alignment is not achieved by trying harder. It emerges when resistance ends. This is why so many of you were led through seasons where things were stripped away. Relationships you thought would last. Roles you thought defined you. Ambitions that once fueled you but later felt hollow. At the time, it may have felt like loss. But what was actually happening was purification. Your signal was being cleared so it could carry something more precise. The frequency you are learning to hold cannot coexist with constant noise. It cannot be sustained by validation, approval, or external certainty. It requires a kind of inner stability that is forged only when those supports are removed. Real leadership does not begin on a stage. It begins in isolation. Not because isolation is holy, but because it is honest. When no one is watching, there is no one to impress. When there is no applause, there is no performance. And what remains is the truth of who you are, when nothing is being reflected back to you. Many of you did not want this responsibility. That hesitation is important. Those who crave leadership often crave control. Those who understand its weight tend to step back. They see what leadership does to the nervous system. They've watched how power distorts when it is held by an unintegrated ego, and they quietly hope someone else will take the role. That reluctance did not disqualify you. It revealed you. Because the kind of leadership the field is calling for now does not dominate. It stabilizes. It does not convince. It grounds. It does not demand attention. It carries presence. Presence is not something you put on. It is something that remains when everything false falls away. You may have noticed that your life trained you in patience, in ways that felt unfair at the time. Delays that made no sense. Doors that closed without explanation. Long stretches where nothing seemed to move. Even though you were doing the inner work, showing up, staying aligned as best you could. Those delays were not punishment. They were calibration. The field does not move its stabilizers quickly. Precision takes time. If movement comes before alignment, the structure collapses. So you were taught to wait, not passively, but attentively, to listen beneath the noise, to feel shifts before they become visible, to trust timing without needing evidence. This is not a popular training. It doesn't photograph well, but it creates leaders who do not panic when systems fail. You were also taught emotional regulation in ways that didn't feel spiritual at all. You learned to pause when triggered, to sit with discomfort without immediately fixing it, to feel fear without letting it drive. These were not personality traits. They were survival skills being refined into wisdom. A leader who cannot regulate their own inner state will unconsciously export chaos wherever they go. That is why your nervous system became part of the training. You were asked to slow down, to rest, to stop overriding your body in the name of productivity or purpose. You were taught that exhaustion is not devotion, and that burnout is not proof of commitment. The field is not interested in how much you can endure. It is interested in how well you can remain coherent. As alignment deepens, relationships change. This is one of the quiet griefs of awakening. Some people drift away without drama. Conversations lose their depth. You find yourself unable to stay interested in surface-level exchanges that once felt normal. This is not judgment. It is resonance shifting. When your frequency changes, you cannot force others to meet you there, and you are no longer willing to abandon yourself to stay connected. The field gently removes what cannot travel with you, not to punish, but to protect the integrity of what you are becoming. You may have also noticed that you were trained to do the right thing when no one would ever know. Integrity without witnesses, kindness without credit, restraint when reaction would have felt justified. These moments mattered more than you realize. They built an internal authority that does not depend on being seen. So when leadership emerges, it doesn't need to announce itself. People feel it. They feel calmer around you, clearer, safer, not because you are trying, but because your inner state is no longer fragmented. This is leadership without ego. Leadership without ego does not mean passivity. It means clarity without aggression, boundaries without cruelty, decisiveness without domination. It means knowing when to speak and when silence carries more intelligence than words. You were also trained not to see yourself as a savior. This is crucial. You are not here to rescue anyone. You are here to point people back to their own connection, their own alignment, their own inner authority. You carry responsibility, not ownership, and that distinction will save you from exhaustion. There is a cost to this path, not a dramatic one, but a quiet one. You lose the luxury of impulsiveness. You become more intentional. You think before you speak. You pause before you act. You listen more than you perform. But what you lose in comfort, you gain in peace. Success begins to feel different. Recognition may come, but it no longer feeds you. You measure progress by stability, by integrity, by how much inner conflict has dissolved. You become less interested in being impressive and more interested in being aligned. And here is the part that brings relief to many of you. The waiting was not a mistake. The stillness was not disobedience. The silence was not absence. It was design. The field was strengthening your foundation so that when movement comes, and it will, you do not fracture under pressure. You do not abandon alignment for speed. You do not trade coherence for approval. When activation happens, it will not feel chaotic. It will feel grounded, calm, almost ordinary, like taking the next obvious step without needing to announce it. You are not being asked to do more right now. You are being asked to stand differently, to respond from peace instead of fear, to allow instead of force, to let the river flow in the direction it was always meant to go. Leadership begins internally long before it becomes visible, and the fact that you no longer need constant reassurance is the confirmation you've been waiting for. You are not late. You are not forgotten. You are not behind. You are aligned. And alignment is what the field responds to. 1. Preparation does not happen under the lights. Those who carry this frequency are rarely prepared in moments of brightness or recognition. Their formation does not take place under applause or affirmation, but within long, quiet seasons where no one is watching, no one is confirming, and sometimes even they themselves cannot explain where they are going. These seasons often feel invisible from the outside, and that invisibility can be deeply uncomfortable for a mind that has been taught to measure progress through movement, achievement, or visible results. Yet this quiet is not emptiness, and it is not neglect. It functions more like a sealed laboratory, a contained environment where distractions are removed and reactions are minimized, where the ego no longer has an audience to perform for, and where consciousness is gently but firmly invited to mature. In that space, you cannot rely on reputation, on roles, or on the familiar identities that once told you who you were supposed to be. What remains is simpler and more demanding at the same time, because you are asked to sit with yourself without escape, without validation, and without certainty. Many people misunderstand these seasons and label them as stagnation or failure. You may have questioned yourself during them, wondering whether you were falling behind while others seemed to advance, whether you had made a wrong turn somewhere, whether your stillness meant you lacked ambition or clarity. But there are movements that cannot be tracked by calendars or measured by milestones. Some changes occur beneath the surface, like roots spreading silently through soil, strengthening and anchoring long before anything visible appears above ground. You are prepared in darkness because the frequency you are learning to hold cannot be built through excitement or momentum alone. It requires a depth of stability that does not collapse when circumstances change, a steadiness that does not depend on praise or reassurance. This kind of stability is not taught in moments of success. It is forged when external supports are removed and you are left to discover what actually holds you up. When no one tells you that you are on the right path, you begin to feel the difference between true alignment and borrowed direction. In these quiet seasons, you slowly learn the distinction between effort and allowance. You notice that the more you force yourself to become something, the more fragmented you feel, as if you are pushing against your own current. But when you soften, when you stop tightening around outcomes and images, something else begins to move. It is subtle at first, like a river that has spent years straining upstream, suddenly releasing the tension in its banks. The water does not disappear. It simply begins to flow in the direction it was always meant to go. Preparation in silence often brings isolation, not as punishment, but as consequence. When old layers fall away, connections built on those layers loosen as well. Conversations that once felt natural may begin to feel shallow. Spaces that once felt meaningful may start to feel hollow. This can be painful, because the human heart is wired for belonging, and letting go of familiar bonds can feel like loss. But not every loss is a mistake. Sometimes, it is simply the body learning to breathe without armor, the nervous system learning safety without constant agreement. Within this quiet, leadership begins to take shape, though not in the way the world defines it. Leadership here is not about directing others or holding influence. It begins with the ability to remain present with yourself when nothing is resolved, when you can sit with uncertainty without rushing to fix it, when you can stay with discomfort without numbing it. Something inside you becomes trustworthy. You start to develop an inner authority that does not need to be asserted, because it is felt. There is a particular kind of humility that grows in these seasons, one that does not come from feeling small, but from seeing clearly. You begin to recognize how little control you truly have, and rather than frightening you, this realization brings relief. You stop exhausting yourself trying to manage every outcome, every perception, every future scenario. You discover that clarity does not arrive through accumulation, through more knowledge or more effort, but through subtraction, through stillness, through listening. Like a lake that only reflects the sky when its surface is calm, awareness reveals truth when it is no longer agitated by the need to dominate or define. These preparatory seasons rarely come with timelines. They do not announce their beginning, and they do not schedule their end. This unsettles the ego, which depends on plans and projections to feel secure. But consciousness is not in a hurry. It understands that some internal structures must fully form before they can withstand the pressure of visibility. A seed pulled from the soil too early never becomes a tree, no matter how much potential it carries. You may have tried to hurry yourself at different points, to push forward simply because waiting felt unbearable. But what you were being taught was not delay, it was precision. You were learning how to move only when something deeper than anxiety initiated the motion. You were learning restraint, not as suppression, but as wisdom. This is why your preparation did not feel dramatic. It felt ordinary. Sometimes it felt boring. Sometimes it felt lonely. But it was shaping something durable inside you. In these quiet laboratories of the soul, you also begin to see that leadership does not require visibility. You are trained to do what is right when no one will ever know, to act from integrity rather than recognition. These moments may seem small, but they carve reliability into your nervous system. Over time, you become someone whose presence carries weight without effort, because you are no longer divided inside. If you find yourself in a phase where life appears calm on the surface but intense beneath, where outer movement has slowed while inner awareness has deepened, understand that this is not an accident. This is preparation at the deepest level. It is not shaping you into a louder version of yourself, but into a steadier one. It is teaching you to trust the flow of life rather than trying to dominate it, to allow rather than to force. And when the time comes, you will not need to chase the light or announce your readiness. Light responds to stability. Responsibility arrives where coherence exists. The same quiet seasons that once made you doubt yourself will reveal their purpose, because they gave you something rare and invaluable. The ability to remain grounded no matter what unfolds around you, not through tension or control, but through the ease of someone who has learned to trust the current carrying them forward. 2. You were not chosen because you are perfect. If perfection were the requirement, no one would be here. That truth is simple, and yet it takes years to truly accept it. Because many of us were raised to believe that worthiness must be earned through flawlessness, through discipline so tight that nothing messy is allowed to show. But the frequency you are resonating with has never responded to polished images or ideal stories. It has never been interested in a spotless past or a carefully curated life. What it responds to is something far quieter and far more honest. What matters is not how clean your history looks, but how you met yourself when life broke you open. Not whether you avoided pain, but whether you stayed present inside it. Not whether you always made the right choices, but whether you were willing to listen when those choices were corrected. The field does not look for those who never fell. It recognizes those who fell and did not harden. You may still carry memories that make you question your place here. Moments you wish you had handled differently. Chapters you rarely talk about. Decisions that changed the course of your life in ways you did not foresee. And there is a temptation to believe that these experiences somehow disqualify you. That if you had been stronger, wiser, more disciplined, you would not have walked through such darkness. But that belief misunderstands the nature of this calling entirely. The intelligence that moves through this frequency does not choose blindly. It does not overlook your history. It does not ignore your fears or your limitations. It knows them fully, and it does not see them as obstacles. It sees how you responded to them when life confronted you. Did you close, or did you stay open even when it hurt? When you were challenged, did you defend your image, or did you allow yourself to be reshaped? That willingness to be changed is not weakness. It is wisdom in its most practical form. There is a kind of softness that develops only through suffering. Not the softness of fragility, but the softness of depth. It is the softness of someone who has discovered that resistance does not heal anything, and that fighting reality only prolongs pain. When you have been brought to your knees by circumstances you could not control, and you found that something in you remained intact, something quiet but unbreakable, you learned a truth that cannot be taught through success. Many of you learned this truth slowly. You did not arrive at it through a single dramatic moment, but through repeated experiences of loss, disappointment, and correction. Each time, life invited you to harden, to protect yourself by closing your heart, by becoming cynical, by deciding that vulnerability was a liability. And each time, perhaps not perfectly, but sincerely, you chose to remain open. You allowed grief to move through you rather than sealing it inside. You allowed regret to teach you rather than define you. You allowed humility to replace pride, not because you were forced, but because you saw that humility was lighter to carry. This is the kind of response that qualifies someone for this frequency. Not moral superiority, not spiritual knowledge, not constant certainty, but a deep capacity to remain permeable, to be corrected without collapsing, to be challenged without becoming defensive, to be stripped of illusions without losing your center. That is not a small thing. That is a rare thing. You were not chosen because you always knew what you were doing. You were chosen because when you realized you did not know, you listened. When life redirected you, you adjusted. When something was taken from you, you grieved, but you did not turn bitter. And bitterness is always a choice, even when pain is not. The fact that you did not choose bitterness, even when it would have been understandable, says more about your readiness than any flawless record ever could. There is also a deep misunderstanding around the idea of strength. Many people believe strength looks like never breaking, never doubting, never needing help. But the kind of strength required to hold this frequency looks very different. It looks like honesty. It looks like admitting when you are tired. It looks like asking for support without shame. It looks like letting go when your hands want to cling. That kind of strength does not announce itself. It does not seek validation. It simply endures. When you were asked to let go of something you loved, something that felt like part of your identity, you did not do it easily. You did it with grief. You did it with confusion. You did it while still wishing things could be different. But you did not resist reality by pretending it was not happening. You did not numb yourself into indifference. You allowed the pain to move through you. And in doing so, you learned how to surrender without disappearing. That lesson is foundational. Surrender is often misunderstood as passivity, as giving up, as weakness. But true surrender is deeply active. It requires awareness, courage, and trust. It is the decision to stop arguing with what is, and to meet the moment fully, rather than retreating into fantasy or control. When you surrendered in this way, you were not abandoning yourself. You were aligning with a deeper intelligence that knows how to carry you when effort fails. This is why your imperfections are not incidental to your path. They are part of the training. They taught you compassion, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. You know what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be judged, to be reduced to a moment rather than seen as a whole person. And because you know that pain, you are less likely to inflict it on others. That awareness softens the way you lead, the way you speak, the way you hold space. It prevents you from turning authority into dominance. You also learned something essential about yourself through failure. You learned that your worth does not vanish when things fall apart. You learned that shame loses its grip when it is met with honesty. You learned that being wrong does not make you unlovable. These realizations are not abstract. They live in your body, in the way your nervous system responds to challenge now. Where you once panicked, you may now pause. Where you once collapsed into self-blame, you may now breathe and stay present. That shift did not come from perfection. It came from experience. There is a quiet maturity that emerges when you stop trying to present yourself as someone who has it all together. You become more real, more grounded, more trustworthy. People feel it when they are with you, even if they cannot explain why. They sense that you are not pretending, that you are not hiding behind spiritual language or moral posturing, that you have been to the places they are afraid of, and you came back with your heart intact. The field recognizes this kind of maturity immediately, not because it is dramatic, but because it is stable. A person who has faced their own darkness without being consumed by it does not fear the darkness in others. They do not rush to fix, judge, or control. They know that healing unfolds at its own pace, and that forcing growth only creates resistance. This understanding is essential for leadership that heals rather than harms. You were also chosen because you learned to forgive yourself, not superficially, not through denial, but through acceptance. You learned to hold your past without constantly reopening old wounds. You learned to extract wisdom rather than punishment from your mistakes. That capacity to integrate rather than repress is what allows energy to move freely through you. Where there is unresolved shame, energy stagnates. Where there is acceptance, flow returns. This is why the frequency responds to softness. Not the softness of avoidance, but the softness of resilience. Like water that does not break against stone but shapes it over time, your willingness to remain open has allowed life to reshape you without destroying you. You no longer need to be flawless to feel aligned. You no longer need to prove that you deserve what is coming. You know, at a level deeper than thought, that worthiness was never the question. The simple truth is this: you were not chosen because you were perfect. You were chosen because you were willing to listen when corrected, willing to grieve when things ended, willing to release when holding on would have cost you your integrity. That willingness is not loud, it does not advertise itself, but it is unmistakable to the field. And if you ever find yourself doubting again, looking at your imperfections and wondering how you could possibly be part of something this significant, remember this: perfection creates distance. It makes people unreachable. But humanity, when met with awareness, creates connection. And connection is the medium through which this frequency moves. 3. Waiting is not delay. Many of you have lived with the uncomfortable feeling of standing still for far too long, watching seasons pass while your outer life appears unchanged, while others seem to move forward with visible momentum, milestones, and confirmation. This sensation can quietly erode confidence, because the mind has been trained to equate movement with progress and speed with success. When nothing appears to be happening, the mind assumes something must be wrong, but the field of consciousness does not move according to the mind's clock, and it does not rush what must be integrated slowly. The field is never still. It simply moves inward before it moves outward. It reorganizes priorities, softens old attachments, and recalibrates perception long before circumstances reflect those changes. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening, but inside, entire structures are being dismantled and rebuilt. This is why waiting often feels heavy, not because it is empty, but because it is full of unseen work. You are being taught something rare during this time, something that cannot be learned through ambition or effort alone. You are learning how to move when guided, rather than when anxious. This distinction is subtle, yet it changes everything. Movement driven by fear always carries tension, even when it produces quick results. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant effort to keep things from falling apart. Movement guided by peace, however, carries its own momentum. It does not exhaust you, because it is aligned with the direction life is already moving. Think of a door that opens when you lean gently against it, rather than forcing it with your shoulder. When you push too hard, you strain yourself and damage the frame. When you wait for the moment the latch releases, the door opens with almost no effort. Waiting teaches you to feel for that release. It trains your nervous system to recognize the difference between urgency and readiness, between impulse and intuition. Many people try to escape waiting by filling it with activity. They distract themselves, overcommit, overthink, or overplan, believing that movement of any kind is better than stillness. But the field is not interested in busyness. It is interested in coherence. Activity that is not aligned fractures energy, while stillness, when allowed, gathers it. This is why waiting often brings discomfort to the surface. Without constant motion to numb it, unresolved fears, old wounds, and unmet desires begin to speak more loudly. This is not regression, it is exposure. The field allows these layers to surface so they can be met, integrated, and released before they are carried into positions of influence. Leaders who have not faced their own fear tend to spread it unconsciously. Leaders who have not made peace with uncertainty tend to impose control. Waiting is the space where these tendencies are softened, not through force, but through awareness. During this time, you may notice a strange contradiction inside yourself. On one hand, you feel a deep sense of calling, a quiet knowing that your life is meant to carry meaning beyond survival. On the other hand, your external reality may look ordinary, even stagnant. This tension can exhaust the mind because it wants evidence. It wants proof that the waiting has a purpose. But the field does not offer proof first. It offers preparation. Waiting teaches trust without reassurance. It teaches faith without applause. It teaches steadiness without certainty. These are not abstract spiritual ideas. They are nervous system skills. You learn how to remain regulated when nothing confirms your direction. You learn how to stay aligned when outcomes are unclear. You learn how to rest without guilt, how to pause without panic, how to remain present without demanding answers. This is why waiting feels different from simple inactivity. Inactivity drains energy. Waiting, when conscious, refines it. You may notice your desires becoming simpler, your tolerance for confusion decreasing, your patience deepening in ways you did not plan. You may find that you no longer feel compelled to chase every opportunity, respond to every invitation, or prove yourself in every conversation. This narrowing is not loss. It is focus. The field is teaching you to conserve energy for what truly matters. There is also a collective dimension to this waiting that is easy to overlook. You are not being prepared in isolation. Others are being refined in different environments, through different pressures, at different speeds. The field moves like an orchestra, not a solo performance. Each instrument tunes quietly before the music begins. If one begins too early, the harmony is lost. Waiting synchronizes those who will eventually move together, even if they never meet in form. This understanding can soften the comparison that often arises during stillness. When you see others advancing, building, announcing, celebrating, it is natural to wonder why your life looks so quiet by comparison. But not all movement is aligned, and not all stillness is stagnant. Some paths require visibility early, while others require depth first. The field knows which is which. Waiting also reveals how you handle uncertainty. When clarity is absent, do you rush to fill the gap with action, or can you remain present without forcing resolution? When answers are delayed, do you assume failure, or do you stay open to a timing larger than your expectations? These moments may seem insignificant, but they are precisely what the field observes. Not to judge, but to see whether you can hold responsibility without collapsing under ambiguity. You may have noticed that waiting has gradually reduced your dependence on external validation. Earlier in your journey, reassurance was necessary, even helpful, but leaders cannot rely on constant confirmation. Waiting trains you to recognize alignment internally, through a sense of calm clarity, rather than dramatic signs. This transition can feel unsettling, because it removes familiar supports, yet it also brings a quiet confidence that does not measure itself against others. There is a particular kind of fatigue that often accompanies this phase. It is not the exhaustion of overwork, but the tiredness of carrying awareness. Seeing more requires energy. Sensing shifts before they happen requires presence. This is why rest becomes essential rather than optional. The field is teaching you how to care for your body, your mind, and your nervous system, not as indulgence, but as stewardship. Leadership requires longevity, not intensity alone. Waiting also teaches restraint, which is often misunderstood. Restraint is not suppression. It is discernment. You learn when to speak, and when silence will do more good. You learn when to act, and when waiting will reveal more information. This balance does not come naturally. It is forged through mistakes, through acting too early and seeing the consequences, through reacting impulsively and feeling the cost. Over time, restraint becomes wisdom rather than effort. One of the hardest aspects of waiting is explaining it to yourself. The mind wants narratives that make sense, reasons that can be justified. When life remains quiet, the mind may suggest that you missed something, that you delayed your own progress, that a hidden failure is responsible. These thoughts are understandable, but they are not accurate. Waiting is not denial, it is design. The field does not move those it is preparing in chaos. It moves them in order, and order begins in stillness. Silence, in this sense, is not absence. It is instruction without interference. It reveals impatience. It exposes insecurity. It surfaces dependence on outcomes. And until these patterns soften, movement would be premature. It would place weight on structures not yet strong enough to hold it. The field is not withholding you from your purpose. It is protecting you from distortion. You are also being taught how to wait without resentment. This is crucial. Waiting that hardens into bitterness closes the very channels that alignment requires. Conscious waiting, however, remains open. It listens, it adjusts, it trusts without demanding. This kind of waiting builds a depth of character that no amount of external success can substitute. Over time, you may notice that your inner pace has slowed, even if your outer responsibilities remain. You respond rather than react. You choose peace over urgency. You sense when something is off and step back without needing to justify yourself. These are not small changes. They are signs of readiness. They indicate that your system is becoming capable of holding pressure without fragmenting. Waiting will not last forever. Stillness is seasonal. but the strength you gain here will follow you into every phase that comes next. When movement begins, it will feel steady rather than frantic, clear rather than overwhelming. You will not rush, because you will not need to. You will recognize the moment, not as excitement, but as resonance. If you are in a season where life feels paused, where plans remain unresolved and answers feel delayed, breathe into that space rather than resisting it. Let your shoulders drop. You are not behind. You are being aligned at a depth that will hold you when nothing else can. Waiting is not asking you to do nothing. It is asking you to remain faithful without evidence, to stay coherent without applause, to trust the field without needing to understand every step. And that trust, quiet and unseen as it may be, is one of the strongest foundations a leader can have. 4. True leadership does not seek power. Those who carry this frequency rarely crave leadership, not because they lack capacity, but because they understand its weight too well. They have seen what power does when it is held by an unexamined ego. They have watched authority turn rigid, empathy disappear behind titles, and control replace care. Some of them have been wounded by such leadership directly, not in abstract ways, but in moments where trust was broken, voices were silenced, and humanity was reduced to compliance. These experiences leave a mark, and that mark often looks like reluctance rather than ambition. This reluctance is not fear in the usual sense. It is awareness. It is the recognition that leadership is not an elevation above others, but a descent into responsibility. To lead is to carry weight that does not belong only to you. It is to hold tension without discharging it onto others. It is to remain grounded when emotions rise around you. Anyone who truly understands this does not rush toward the role. They pause, they listen, they hesitate, not because they doubt their worth, but because they respect the impact their presence can have on others. The world often teaches leadership as conquest, visibility, and dominance. It rewards those who speak the loudest, move the fastest, and claim the most space. But the field of consciousness operates by a different logic entirely. It does not entrust power to those who hunger for it. It entrusts responsibility to those who can hold it without needing it to validate them. This is why the ones most aligned with true leadership often appear unassuming. They do not announce themselves. They do not compete for attention. They do not measure their value by influence or applause. Many of you learned early that control is a poor substitute for safety. You watched people attempt to dominate situations out of fear, and you felt the damage that caused. Perhaps you were on the receiving end of it, where rules replaced understanding and authority dismissed vulnerability. These experiences taught you something quietly but deeply. You learned that power without presence is violence, even when it wears polite language. And because you learned this through lived experience, you became cautious about stepping into positions where you could repeat that harm. This caution is not weakness. It is discernment shaped by empathy. It signals that you do not see leadership as a prize to be won, but as a trust to be honored. The field recognizes this immediately. It does not respond to ambition driven by image or outcome. It responds to humility that understands consequence. It responds to those who are not addicted to being right, not dependent on being seen, and not threatened by standing beside others rather than above them. True leadership begins with self-governance. Before you can guide anyone else, you must learn how to hold yourself steady. You must learn how to regulate your own emotions without suppressing them, how to listen without preparing a response, how to pause without losing clarity. This inner discipline is rarely visible, but it is everything. Without it, leadership becomes reactionary. With it, leadership becomes stabilizing. Many of you were trained in this long before you realized it. Life placed you in situations where you had little control and no authority, where you were forced to develop patience, restraint, and perspective. You learned how to stay present when outcomes were uncertain. You learned how to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. You learned how to sit with discomfort without making others responsible for it. These were not random lessons. They were foundational training. You may see now that leadership, in its truest form, does not require domination or certainty. It requires the capacity to remain open, to say, "I do not know," without collapsing, to receive feedback without becoming defensive, to admit mistakes without losing dignity, This openness creates trust far more effectively than confidence ever could. People sense when someone is grounded enough to be honest, and they relax in that presence. The field does not need leaders who perform strength. It needs leaders who embody coherence. Coherence means your words align with your actions, your values align with your decisions, and your inner state aligns with the energy you bring into a room. When coherence is present, authority emerges naturally. You do not have to demand respect. It arises as a response to stability. This is why those who seek power often disqualify themselves. The hunger for control usually masks insecurity. It relies on comparison, validation, and external reinforcement. But the field cannot entrust influence to a nervous system that needs constant affirmation. Such systems collapse under pressure or become rigid to protect themselves. True leadership requires flexibility without fragility, firmness without harshness. These qualities develop only in those who have learned to find their worth internally rather than through dominance. You may have noticed that you feel uneasy in spaces where leadership is performative, where authority is loud but shallow, where certainty is projected but not lived. That discomfort is not judgment. It is resonance signaling misalignment. You are sensitive to integrity because your own system has been trained to recognize it. This sensitivity can feel like a burden at times because it makes it difficult to tolerate superficial structures. But it is also a gift. It prevents you from perpetuating patterns that harm rather than heal. True leadership also understands limits. It knows when to step forward and when to step back. It does not need to be at the center of every conversation. It does not fear the growth or insight of others. In fact, it welcomes it, because leadership that is not driven by ego understands that collective strength is not a threat, but a foundation. Those aligned with this frequency often struggle early with the idea of authority because they associate it with domination. They have seen how it can wound. But over time, through inner work and lived experience, they begin to differentiate authority from control. Authority, in this sense, is not imposed. It is granted by presence. It is the natural result of clarity, consistency, and care. When authority flows from presence, it does not need to convince. It does not need to intimidate. It does not need to explain itself endlessly. It is felt. Like gravity, it organizes space quietly. People respond to it not because they are told to, but because something in them recognizes safety and coherence. This is also why true leadership does not rush. It does not force outcomes. It understands timing. It recognizes that premature movement can do more harm than good. This patience is not passivity. It is precision. It reflects an understanding that influence without readiness creates fracture. So those who carry this frequency often wait longer than others, not because they are uncertain, but because they are responsible. You may have noticed that your motivation has shifted over time. You care less about being seen and more about being useful in quiet ways. You feel less drawn to recognition and more drawn to integrity. This is not loss of ambition. It is refinement of intention. The field responds to intention far more than to performance. True leadership does not come from wanting to lead. It comes from being willing to carry what leadership requires. It comes from knowing the cost and accepting it without resentment. It comes from choosing humility over superiority, service over control, alignment over appearance. If you feel a hesitation around leadership, do not dismiss it as fear. Sit with it. Listen to it. Often, it is wisdom asking you to remain grounded. The field does not need more leaders who are certain. It needs leaders who are steady. Leaders who can stand in complexity without simplifying it into slogans. Leaders who can hold opposing truths without fragmenting. Leaders who can remain human while carrying responsibility. Power sought for identity always corrupts. Power held as stewardship heals. And the field, in its quiet intelligence, knows the difference. That is why it waits. That is why it refines. And that is why it entrusts leadership only to those who do not need it to feel whole. 5. Isolation is the stage where inner authority is formed. There are long stretches in life when it feels as though you are walking alone, not dramatically alone, not abandoned in an obvious way, but quietly separate, as if the world is moving at a volume that no longer matches your inner rhythm. Conversations continue. Systems operate. People gather and move together, yet something in you stands slightly apart, listening rather than participating. This experience can be deeply unsettling, because we are taught to associate togetherness with safety and isolation with failure. But what you were moving through was not abandonment, it was protection. The noise around you had become too loud for truth to be heard clearly. Not noise in the sense of sound, but noise in the form of expectations, opinions, projections, borrowed beliefs, and unconscious agreements. When everything around you speaks at once, even wisdom becomes distorted. Isolation creates a pause in that interference. It reduces the volume so that what is real can begin to speak again. In these seasons, you were not pushed away from people, you were pulled inward. And inward movement always feels like loss at first, because it removes familiar reference points. Without the reflections of others, you no longer know who you are by contrast. Without constant feedback, you cannot rely on approval or disagreement to orient yourself. This is where the deeper work begins. Isolation teaches you how to trust what you know without consensus. This is not stubbornness, and it is not arrogance. It is the slow development of inner listening. You begin to notice that there is a difference between knowing something because it is popular and knowing something because it resonates in your body. One requires agreement to feel real, the other does not. At first, this can be frightening. When no one confirms your direction, doubt naturally arises. You may question your instincts, second-guess your perceptions, and wonder whether your sense of things is flawed. But over time, as you continue to listen, something stabilizes. You begin to recognize patterns. You notice that when you ignore your inner knowing, things feel tight, dissonant, and forced. And when you honor it, even when it costs you comfort or familiarity, something relaxes inside you. This feedback loop slowly builds trust. This trust is not intellectual. It is embodied. It lives in your nervous system, in the way your breath settles when you are aligned, in the way your body tenses when something is off. Isolation gives you the space to feel these signals without interference. Without the constant input of others' opinions, you become more sensitive to your own internal guidance. This sensitivity is not weakness. It is attunement. Many of you spent years in this kind of quiet separation. You may have felt misunderstood, out of place, or unseen. You may have wondered why relationships faded or why you no longer fit easily into environments that once felt normal. This was not because you became superior or disconnected. It was because your inner reference point was shifting. You were no longer orienting yourself through external validation. You were learning how to stand from the inside. Standing from the inside requires steadiness, and steadiness is not built through constant agreement. It is built through holding your ground when there is none. When you make a decision that feels true even though no one applauds it. When you walk away from something that everyone else insists is valuable. When you choose silence instead of explanation, because you sense that speaking would only dilute your clarity. These moments shape inner authority far more than public recognition ever could. Inner authority is often misunderstood. It is not dominance. It does not seek to control others or impose itself on situations. It is quiet confidence rooted in coherence. When you are internally aligned, you do not need to convince. You do not need to prove. Your presence speaks without effort. People may not always agree with you, but they sense that you are not pretending. That authenticity creates a form of respect that cannot be demanded. Isolation also reveals how much of your previous identity was built through mirroring. When you are no longer surrounded by people who reinforce familiar roles, you begin to see what remains when those roles dissolve. This can feel disorienting. You may ask yourself who you are, without the labels, without the responsibilities, without the expectations placed on you. The answers do not come quickly. They emerge slowly, through observation rather than effort. In solitude, you see your patterns more clearly. You notice where you seek approval. You notice where you avoid discomfort. You notice where fear still drives your choices. This awareness can be uncomfortable, but it is honest. And honesty is the foundation of real authority. Authority that has not examined itself eventually becomes rigid or cruel. Authority that knows its own shadows remains flexible and humane. You may also have discovered that isolation stripped away unnecessary urgency. Without constant comparison, the pressure to keep up begins to fade. You realize that much of what you once chased was driven by fear of falling behind rather than genuine desire. In this quieter space, priorities reorganize themselves. You become less interested in appearing successful and more interested in feeling aligned. This shift is subtle, but it changes the direction of your life. There is a particular strength that develops when you learn how to be alone without feeling lonely. Loneliness seeks escape. Solitude invites depth. In solitude, you learn how to sit with your thoughts without being consumed by them. You learn how to feel emotions without dramatizing them. You learn how to be present without needing constant stimulation. These skills are essential for leadership, because leadership often involves holding space without immediately resolving tension. When you are comfortable in your own company, you are less likely to seek control over others. You do not need them to behave a certain way for you to feel stable. This emotional independence creates safety for those around you. They feel less pressure to perform or conform. They sense that you are grounded enough to allow difference without threat. This is one of the quiet hallmarks of inner authority. Isolation also trains discernment. When external voices quiet down, you become more selective about what you let in. You notice that not every opinion deserves your attention, and not every invitation deserves your energy. This discernment is not judgment, it is care. You are learning how to protect the coherence of your inner state, because you have experienced how easily it can be disrupted by noise. There were likely moments during these seasons when you felt tempted to reinsert yourself into familiar dynamics, simply to avoid the discomfort of standing alone. But each time you resisted that temptation, you strengthened your inner spine. You learned that discomfort does not mean danger, and that clarity often requires distance. Over time, this builds resilience. You become someone who can tolerate misunderstanding without collapsing or retaliating. Inner authority does not announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency, through the way you make decisions when no one is watching, through the way you hold your values when they are inconvenient, through the way you remain calm when others panic. These qualities are not cultivated in crowds. They are formed in the quiet, where you have no one to lean on but yourself, and something deeper moving through you. This is why isolation often precedes any form of meaningful influence. Before you can guide others, you must know how to stand without guidance. Before you can offer clarity, you must have faced confusion without running from it. Before you can hold responsibility, you must have learned how to carry yourself. These lessons cannot be rushed or outsourced. They must be lived. If you look back now, you may see that the periods you once resented were the ones that shaped you most profoundly. The times when you felt cut off were the times when your inner voice became clearer. The moments when you felt unseen were the moments when you stopped performing and started listening. What felt like separation was actually initiation. You were not isolated because you were unworthy of connection. You were isolated because your system needed quiet to calibrate. You were being prepared to lead without leaning, to stand without comparison, to trust without constant reassurance. That is not a punishment. That is a privilege, even if it did not feel like one at the time. And when you eventually re-enter shared spaces, you do so differently. You do not seek agreement. You do not need validation. You bring steadiness rather than noise. Your words carry weight because they come from lived experience, not borrowed certainty. This is inner authority made visible, not through assertion, but through presence. Isolation, then, was not an ending. It was a foundation. It taught you how to hear truth when it speaks softly. It taught you how to remain grounded when the world pulls in many directions. It taught you how to stand alone so that, one day, others could stand more securely in your presence. 6. This frequency requires emotional discipline, not control. Leadership aligned with the field of consciousness is often misunderstood as emotional neutrality, as if to lead well one must feel less, react less, or care less. In truth, the opposite is required. This frequency asks for the capacity to feel deeply without being consumed, to sense the full range of human emotion without allowing any single wave to pull you out of coherence. It is not about suppressing emotion, and it is certainly not about denying it. It is about developing a relationship with emotion that is honest, spacious, and grounded. Emotional discipline is very different from emotional control. Control tightens, it contracts, It tries to dominate what is arising inside you, labeling certain feelings as unacceptable and others as permissible. Discipline, on the other hand, is a form of care. It creates enough inner space for emotion to move without taking over the entire system. It allows anger to be felt without becoming aggression, sadness to be honored without collapsing into despair, and fear to be acknowledged without allowing it to dictate your actions. Many of you were trained in emotional discipline long before you realized it. Life placed you in situations where reacting would have caused more harm than good. Moments where speaking immediately would have escalated conflict. Situations where defending yourself would have cost you clarity. Experiences where you learned, sometimes painfully, that the first impulse is not always the wisest response. These moments were not accidents. They were rehearsals. You learned to pause, not because you were passive, but because you sensed that something deeper was required of you. You learned that stillness in the face of activation is not weakness. It is strength refined. When your nervous system becomes activated, everything inside you wants to move, to explain, to correct, to push back. Emotional discipline is the capacity to feel that surge fully while choosing not to act from it. That choice changes the outcome of entire situations. Responding, rather than reacting, is not a technique you apply. It is a state you embody. Reaction happens when emotion moves faster than awareness. Response happens when awareness is present enough to include the emotion without being driven by it. This is why emotional discipline cannot be faked. It must be built through repeated experience, through moments where you stayed with discomfort rather than escaping it, through times where you allowed feelings to rise and fall without turning them into action prematurely. This is especially important for those carrying this frequency, because sensitivity is not optional. You feel more than most. You notice subtle shifts in energy, tone, and intention. You sense what is unspoken. This depth of perception can be overwhelming without discipline. Without it, sensitivity turns into reactivity. With it, sensitivity becomes discernment. Discernment allows you to separate what belongs to you from what does not. You learn to recognize when an emotional charge is arising from your own unresolved material and when it is simply information passing through your system. This distinction is crucial. Leaders who cannot tell the difference often act out their own wounds under the guise of responsibility. Leaders who have done this inner work can hold space for others without personalizing everything that arises. You were also taught the value of stopping when triggered, not shutting down, not numbing out, but stopping in awareness. This pause is sacred. It creates a gap between stimulus and response where choice becomes possible. In that gap, you can ask a deeper question. Not how do I win this, but what is being asked of me here? Not how do I prove I am right, but what will bring clarity rather than escalation? Over time, you may have noticed that your relationship with being right has changed. There was a time when being correct felt essential, when disagreement felt like threat, when misunderstanding felt unbearable. Emotional discipline softens this need. You realize that truth does not require defense. It reveals itself when the environment is safe enough to hold it. Creating that safety is one of the most powerful forms of leadership. Holding space does not mean tolerating harm or avoiding boundaries. It means maintaining an inner environment where honesty can emerge without fear of punishment or ridicule. When people feel emotionally safe, they tell the truth. When they feel threatened, they perform or withdraw. Leaders who understand this do not rush to correct. They listen first. They allow complexity. They trust that clarity unfolds more reliably in calm than in chaos. This is why emotional discipline often looks like restraint from the outside. You may choose silence when others expect a response. You may choose patience when others demand action. You may choose listening when others want certainty. These choices are not avoidance. They are precision. They reflect an understanding that emotional energy, when mishandled, can distort even the best intentions. Many of you learned this through painful trial and error. You saw what happened when emotion drove decisions. You experienced the cost of reacting too quickly. You watched situations unravel because someone needed immediate relief rather than long-term coherence. These experiences taught you that power without regulation is dangerous, not only to others, but to yourself. Emotional discipline also changes how you experience conflict. Conflict no longer feels like something to eliminate or dominate. It becomes information. It shows you where misalignment exists, where values differ, where understanding is incomplete. Rather than rushing to resolve it, you learn to stay present with it long enough for something new to emerge. This patience often transforms conflict into insight. There is a quiet courage required for this kind of leadership. It takes courage to remain open when you feel misunderstood, courage to stay grounded when emotions rise around you, courage to choose clarity over relief. Many people mistake emotional expression for authenticity, but authenticity is not the same as discharge. Authenticity is alignment between what you feel, what you value, and how you act. Emotional discipline ensures that this alignment remains intact, even under pressure. You may have noticed that as this discipline deepened, your inner world became less chaotic, not because emotions disappeared, but because they stopped fighting for control. They were allowed to exist without needing to dominate. This internal coherence creates a sense of safety within you, which then extends outward. Others feel it. They may not know why they trust you, but they sense that you will not react impulsively, that you will not weaponize emotion, that you will not collapse under intensity. This is one of the reasons the field requires emotional discipline rather than control. Control is brittle. It breaks under stress. Discipline is flexible. It adapts. It holds. Control relies on suppression, which eventually erupts. Discipline relies on awareness, which integrates. Only the latter can sustain leadership over time. You also learned that emotional discipline includes care for the body. You became aware of how fatigue, hunger, and overstimulation affect your capacity to respond wisely. You learned to rest without guilt, to step back when overwhelmed, to respect your limits rather than override them. This is not self-indulgence. It is stewardship. A leader who ignores their own nervous system will eventually impose that dysregulation on others. This frequency does not ask you to be emotionless. It asks you to be trustworthy with emotion, to allow it, to feel it, to learn from it, and then to choose from a deeper place. This trustworthiness is felt immediately. It creates environments where others can also regulate, reflect, and respond rather than react. As you reflect on your journey, you may see that every moment of emotional restraint, every pause you took instead of reacting, every time you chose presence over impulse, contributed to this capacity. What once felt like self-denial was actually self-refinement. You were not being asked to shrink. You were being asked to deepen. True strength does not come from overpowering emotion. It comes from holding it with awareness until it reveals its message and releases its charge. This is the discipline that allows truth to emerge without force. This is the discipline that allows leadership to heal rather than harm. And this is why the field entrusts responsibility only to those who can feel deeply without being ruled by what they feel. 7. Purification changes relationships. As you become clearer within yourself, not everyone can continue walking beside you. This realization often arrives quietly, without drama or confrontation, and that quietness can make it confusing at first. There may be no obvious conflict, no single moment where things fall apart, just a gradual sense that certain connections no longer meet you where you are. Conversations feel thinner. Shared spaces feel heavier. The ease that once existed begins to fade. Not because anyone is wrong, but because something essential has shifted inside you. This is not loss in the way the mind usually defines it. It is restructuring. When your inner alignment deepens, the field naturally reorganizes the relationships around you so that your external world can reflect your internal coherence. This process is rarely dramatic because it does not need to be. It works gently, loosening attachments that can no longer support the depth and pace you are entering. Many people experience guilt during this phase. They wonder if they are becoming distant, judgmental, or selfish. They question whether spiritual growth should feel more inclusive rather than more selective. But discernment is not exclusion, and clarity is not rejection. You are not pushing people away. You are simply no longer bending yourself to fit spaces that require you to shrink, explain, or dull your awareness in order to belong. Earlier in your life, connection may have been built on shared habits, shared wounds, or shared identities. These forms of bonding serve a purpose at certain stages, but they cannot sustain you indefinitely. As purification occurs, the need for constant agreement fades. You begin to value resonance over familiarity. You start to notice when being with someone requires effort rather than presence, when it drains rather than nourishes. This noticing is not cruelty, it is honesty. The field does not remove relationships as punishment, it removes them as protection. When you continue to carry connections that no longer align, you are forced to compromise your truth in subtle ways. You may speak less freely. You may suppress insight to avoid discomfort. You may carry emotional weight that is not yours. Over time, these compromises create inner tension, and tension eventually turns into exhaustion. The field intervenes before that exhaustion becomes your identity. This restructuring often happens without clear explanations. People drift away. Invitations stop arriving. Conversations lose their rhythm. At first, this can feel like abandonment, especially if you are accustomed to maintaining relationships through effort. But effort is not the same as connection. Real connection flows. When it no longer flows, forcing it only creates friction. You may grieve during this process, even when you understand it intellectually. Grief does not mean you made the wrong choice. It means you are human. You can honor what a relationship once offered without trying to preserve it beyond its natural season. Holding on past that point does not deepen love. It distorts it. As purification continues, you may also notice that your tolerance for certain dynamics decreases. You become less willing to engage in superficial exchanges, repetitive conflict, or emotional manipulation. This is not because you lack compassion. It is because your nervous system has learned the cost of such patterns. You have felt what it does to your body and mind to remain in environments that constantly pull you out of alignment. Choosing differently is an act of care, not rejection. There is a quiet confidence that begins to form when you stop negotiating your inner truth for the sake of connection. You learn that belonging does not require self-abandonment. In fact, the deeper your alignment, the less you are able to tolerate relationships that demand it. This clarity can feel lonely at times, because the space between relationships can widen before new forms of connection arrive. But this space is not empty. It is fertile. The field often clears space before introducing new resonance. It does this so that when aligned relationships do appear, there is room to receive them fully. These connections tend to feel different from what you knew before. They require less explanation. They do not rely on constant reassurance. Silence does not feel awkward. Presence feels enough. This is not coincidence. It is coherence meeting coherence. You may also find that relationships which remain begin to transform. Depth replaces habit. Honesty replaces performance. Some connections survive purification, not because they resist change, but because they adapt with it. These relationships often become simpler and more authentic. They no longer need to be maintained through effort. They are sustained through mutual respect for each other's inner authority. This process can be especially challenging for those who were taught to measure their worth through relational harmony. If you learned early that being liked was a form of safety, the loss of certain connections can feel threatening. But as purification unfolds, you begin to experience a different kind of safety, one that comes from integrity rather than approval, one that does not depend on constant emotional labor. There may be moments when you are tempted to reinsert yourself into old dynamics, simply to avoid the discomfort of change. The familiarity can feel soothing, even when it costs you clarity. But each time you resist that pull, you strengthen your inner alignment. You learn that discomfort is not danger, and that peace is not always immediate. Sometimes peace arrives only after you allow something to end. Purification also reveals which relationships were built on control rather than connection. When you stop accommodating, stop explaining, stop rescuing, these dynamics often dissolve on their own. This can be painful, but it is also revealing. It shows you that the relationship required imbalance to function. An imbalance is not something the field allows to persist once awareness is present. You may notice that as relationships fall away, your energy becomes more available. You feel less pulled in multiple directions. Your attention becomes steadier. Your emotional life feels simpler. This simplicity is not emptiness. It is clarity. It allows you to show up more fully in the relationships that remain, and to be present in your own life without constant fragmentation. Another aspect of purification is learning how to let others walk their own paths without interference. When relationships change, there can be a desire to explain, justify, or manage how others perceive the shift. But true alignment does not require permission. You do not need everyone to understand your evolution for it to be valid. Releasing the need to be understood by everyone is a significant step in maturity. As you move through this restructuring, you may find that your sense of community changes as well. You may no longer feel drawn to large groups or constant social engagement. You may prefer fewer connections with greater depth. This is not withdrawal, it is refinement. The field is teaching you that quality of connection matters more than quantity. Purification also affects how you relate to yourself. As external noise decreases, your inner dialogue becomes clearer. You notice when you are acting from habit rather than truth. You become more honest about what nourishes you and what depletes you. This self-awareness supports healthier boundaries, which in turn support healthier relationships. Healthy boundaries are not walls. They are agreements with yourself about how you will care for your energy. When boundaries are in place, resentment decreases, clarity increases. Relationships become more sustainable because they are no longer fueled by overgiving or unspoken expectation. You may also discover that purification brings periods of solitude between relationships. These periods are not failures. They are integration phases. They allow you to settle into your new alignment without immediately adjusting to another person's rhythm. In solitude, your clarity stabilizes. You become more comfortable being with yourself without distraction. This comfort makes future relationships more grounded rather than compensatory. Over time, you begin to trust the field's intelligence in this process. You see that nothing essential is taken from you. What leaves was either complete or incompatible. What remains is cleaner, truer, and more supportive of who you are becoming. The fear of loss gradually gives way to relief. You realize how much energy was being spent maintaining connections that no longer reflected your truth. Purification teaches you that connection does not require contraction. You do not have to dim yourself to be loved. You do not have to perform to be accepted. The relationships that survive and emerge from this process honor your wholeness rather than requiring fragments of it. If you are in a phase where relationships are shifting, fading, or transforming, allow the process without rushing to interpret it as failure. Trust that the field is reorganizing your relational landscape with care. It is creating space for connections that can meet you in depth, honesty, and presence. This is not a lonely path in the long run. It is a clearer one. And clarity, even when it brings temporary solitude, ultimately creates connection that is sustainable, respectful, and real. 8. You were trained to lead without being seen. One of the deepest forms of training you received did not happen in public moments, did not come with recognition, and did not leave any visible trace for others to point to later. It happened in the quiet choices you made, when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain, and when doing the right thing actually cost you comfort, approval, or ease. This kind of training is invisible by design, because its purpose is not to shape behavior for an audience, but to rewire the nervous system for integrity. In those moments, there was no applause waiting for you, no validation, no reassurance that your effort mattered. Often, there was not even a clear sense that you were being tested at all. It simply felt like life asking you a small, ordinary question, again and again, asking whether you would stay true to yourself when no external reward was offered. Over time, these questions accumulated, not as memories, but as patterns etched into how you move through the world. Integrity is not an idea, it is a felt sense. It lives in the body as much as in the mind. Each time you chose honesty over convenience, restraint over reaction, care over self-interest, something subtle shifted in your nervous system. You became someone who could be trusted by yourself. That trust did not come from success or recognition. It came from consistency, from knowing that even when no one was looking, you would not abandon your values. Many people never experience this kind of training because they learn to behave well only when observed. Their sense of right and wrong is regulated externally, by praise or punishment, by reputation or fear of consequence. But leadership aligned with the field of consciousness cannot rely on external regulation. It requires an internal compass that functions even in complete solitude. This is why your path often felt quiet, unnoticed, and at times even discouraging. You were being shaped for something that could not depend on visibility. You may recall moments when you wondered if your efforts were meaningless because no one acknowledged them. Times when you chose patience instead of retaliation, and nothing improved immediately. Times when you spoke with integrity and it went unnoticed or was misunderstood. These moments can feel deflating to the ego because the ego seeks reinforcement. But the field was not shaping your ego. It was shaping your coherence. Coherence is what allows presence to carry weight. It is what allows your words to land without force, your silence to communicate without explanation, your choices to feel grounded rather than reactive. This kind of presence cannot be rehearsed. It cannot be imitated convincingly. It emerges naturally when there is no gap between what you believe, what you feel, and how you act. Leading without being seen also taught you humility in a very practical way. Not the performative humility of self-depreciation, but the grounded humility of knowing that your value does not depend on being noticed. When you release the need to be seen, you become freer to see clearly. You listen more deeply. You observe more carefully. You respond more accurately. This clarity is a form of power, though it does not announce itself as such. There is a quiet discipline required to continue doing what is right without external confirmation. Over time, this discipline becomes second nature. You stop expecting reward for integrity. You stop measuring your worth by outcome. You begin to act from alignment rather than anticipation. This shift changes the quality of your energy. It becomes steadier, less urgent, less performative. Others may not immediately recognize why they feel calm around you, but they feel it nonetheless. The field values this steadiness above all else. In moments of pressure, visibility attracts distortion. When attention increases, the temptation to perform, to impress, to control also increases. Those who have not learned how to function without being seen often struggle when they are suddenly noticed. They begin to adjust themselves to maintain approval. Their decisions shift subtly toward image rather than truth. This is not a moral failing. It is a lack of training. You were trained differently. You learned to make decisions without an audience, which means your decision-making process is not hijacked by perception. You are less likely to abandon clarity for popularity, less likely to compromise truth for comfort. This does not mean you never doubt yourself. It means your doubt does not paralyze you, and it does not push you to seek reassurance prematurely. There is also a particular resilience that develops when you learn to operate without recognition. You become less reactive to praise and less destabilized by criticism. Neither has the power to define you anymore. This emotional independence is not detachment. It is stability. It allows you to remain present regardless of how others respond. And this presence is what makes leadership possible without coercion. You may notice that when you speak, you do not need to raise your voice. When you enter a space, you do not need to assert yourself. When you offer guidance, it does not feel forced. This is because your system is no longer seeking permission to exist. You have already granted it to yourself through years of unseen practice. Leading without being seen also taught you patience with timing. When recognition is not immediate, you learn to trust processes that unfold slowly. You learn to wait for alignment rather than forcing momentum. This patience becomes invaluable later, when responsibility increases and decisions carry broader impact. You are less likely to rush, less likely to panic, less likely to act out of urgency. There is a quiet paradox here. The less you needed to be seen, the more prepared you became to be visible. Visibility, when it arrives, does not inflate you because you are not hungry for it. It does not overwhelm you because you are not dependent on it. You can step into it without losing yourself because your sense of self was never built on attention in the first place. This is why, when the time comes, you will not need to explain who you are or prove why you belong. Your presence will speak before you do. People will sense consistency. They will feel safety. They will notice that you do not rush to assert authority. Yet authority seems to follow you naturally. This is not charisma in the conventional sense. It is coherence made visible. You may have once believed that leadership required visibility from the beginning, that influence had to be claimed early and loudly. But the field works differently. It prepares its stabilizers quietly. It allows them to grow roots before branches. It teaches them how to stand without witnesses so that when witnesses appear, standing does not change them. If you reflect honestly, you may see that some of the most formative moments of your life were the ones no one knows about. The private decisions, the unseen sacrifices, the quiet restraint, the moments when you chose integrity over ease. These moments did not disappear. They accumulated. They shaped your nervous system, your perception, your capacity to hold complexity without fragmenting. This is why you do not need to chase recognition now. You do not need to announce your readiness. You do not need to prove your value. What you carry is already integrated. And when movement happens, it will not feel like performance. It will feel like continuation. Leading without being seen was never about hiding. It was about preparation. It was about ensuring that when responsibility arrives, it does not distort you. It was about building an inner foundation, strong enough to hold influence without losing humility, visibility without losing integrity, and impact without losing yourself. The weight you carry now is not heaviness. It is gravity. And gravity does not need to be loud to be felt. 9. Leadership without ego is service, not self-sacrifice. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about spiritual leadership is the belief that it requires depletion, that to serve means to empty yourself until nothing remains, that exhaustion is proof of devotion. Many people quietly carry this belief, and because of it, they burn out while trying to do good. They confuse giving with disappearing, and they mistake self-neglect for humility. But this frequency was never meant to be held by someone who is breaking themselves apart in the process. You were not called to lose yourself. You were called to bring yourself fully. And there is a profound difference between the two. Leadership without ego does not ask you to abandon your needs or deny your limits. It asks you to become deeply honest about them. It asks you to recognize that service offered from depletion is unstable, and that guidance offered from exhaustion carries distortion. No matter how sincere the intention, a system that is already strained cannot stabilize another. A nervous system that is overwhelmed cannot create safety for others. This is not a moral judgment. It is a simple truth of how energy works. True service emerges from fullness, from presence that is resourced rather than drained, from a body that is rested enough to listen, a mind that is clear enough to discern, and a heart that is open without being raw. This kind of fullness does not come from indulgence or avoidance. It comes from responsibility toward yourself, responsibility to care for the vessel through which service moves. Many of you had to unlearn the belief that saying no makes you selfish. Earlier in your life, you may have been praised for overgiving, for accommodating, for being available at all times. You may have learned that love was conditional on usefulness, that rest had to be earned, that boundaries were inconveniences rather than necessities. These beliefs often formed quietly, through experience rather than instruction, and they followed you into your spiritual life, disguised as virtue. But ego-driven sacrifice always carries resentment, even when it is hidden. It drains joy from service and replaces it with obligation. Over time, it erodes clarity. You may have noticed that when you give beyond your capacity, your presence becomes thinner, your patience shortens, your ability to listen decreases. This is not failure, it is feedback. The field uses your body as a messenger, reminding you when balance has been lost. Leadership without ego listens to this feedback. It does not override it in the name of duty. It understands that rest is not retreat, it is maintenance. It is the pause that allows alignment to be restored. You learn that you can step back without abandoning your purpose, that you can say no without betraying your values, that you can rest without falling behind. These realizations do not come easily, especially if your identity was once tied to being needed. Learning to say no without guilt is a profound initiation. It requires you to disentangle your worth from your availability. It asks you to trust that your value does not disappear when you choose yourself. This trust can feel risky at first. You may fear disappointing others, losing connection, or being misunderstood. But each time you honor your limits, you strengthen your inner authority. You teach your system that safety does not require self-abandonment. This is where leadership becomes sustainable. Not because you do less, but because you do what you do from a place of coherence. You no longer give to be seen, to be approved of, or to be indispensable. You give because there is capacity, because there is clarity, because service, when offered freely rather than compulsively, carries a different quality. It nourishes rather than depletes. Leadership without ego also reframes responsibility. You are responsible for the space you hold, not for the outcomes others choose. You can offer guidance without controlling direction. You can support without rescuing. You can care without carrying what does not belong to you. This distinction is subtle, but it protects both you and those you serve. Rescue creates dependency. Support fosters autonomy. Many of you learned this distinction through painful experience. You gave too much, stayed too long, carried burdens that were never yours, and eventually, your body or your circumstances forced you to stop. These moments were not punishments. They were corrections. They taught you that compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure, and that true service respects the dignity of others by allowing them to walk their own paths. Rest, in this context, becomes an ethical practice rather than a luxury. When you rest, you are not withdrawing from service. You are ensuring that your service remains clean. You are preventing burnout from turning care into obligation. You are preserving the quality of your presence. This is especially important for those who carry sensitivity, because sensitivity without rest leads to overwhelm. Overwhelm leads to shutdown or reactivity. Neither serves anyone. Leadership without ego understands cycles. It knows when to act and when to pause. It honors seasons of outward contribution and seasons of inward replenishment. It does not shame itself for needing recovery. It recognizes that even the most fertile land requires fallow periods to remain productive. Continuous output without rest depletes the soil. Continuous giving without restoration depletes the soul. There is also a quiet humility in this form of leadership. You stop believing that everything depends on you. You trust the intelligence of the field to continue moving, even when you step back. This trust dissolves the savior complex that often hides beneath spiritual ambition. You are not here to carry the world on your shoulders. You are here to play your part with integrity, and then to release control. This release is not indifference. It is respect. Respect for the autonomy of others. Respect for the timing of life. Respect for your own limits. When you release the need to fix everything, you become more effective where your presence is actually needed. Your energy becomes focused rather than scattered. Your service becomes precise rather than compulsive. You may notice that as ego-driven sacrifice falls away, your relationships with those you serve change. There is less dependency and more mutual respect. People feel empowered rather than managed. They sense that you are not using service to define yourself, and this creates trust. You become someone others can lean on without fearing collapse, because you are not overextended. Leadership without ego also frees you from martyrdom. You no longer need to suffer to justify your role. You no longer equate pain with virtue. This does not mean the path is easy. It means suffering is no longer self-imposed. Challenges are met as part of life, not as proof of worth. This shift brings a quiet joy back into service. Not excitement, but contentment. A sense that what you are offering is aligned rather than forced. As you embody this, you may find that your presence alone becomes supportive. You do not always need to do or say much. You create environments where others can regulate, reflect, and reconnect with themselves. This is service at a deep level. It does not exhaust you because it flows from who you are rather than from what you perform. Leadership without ego also includes the courage to step aside, to allow others to lead, to recognize when your role has shifted. This flexibility prevents stagnation. It keeps service alive rather than rigid. Ego resists stepping back because it equates identity with position. Alignment welcomes it because it understands that service changes form over time. You may also discover that your relationship with success changes. You are less interested in visible impact and more attentive to subtle shifts. You notice when clarity increases, when fear decreases, when people feel safer. These signs matter more than numbers or recognition. They tell you that coherence is spreading, and coherence is the true currency of this frequency. When you look back on your journey, you may see how carefully you were trained for this, how life taught you limits through exhaustion, how boundaries were forged through discomfort, how rest became necessary through burnout. None of this was wasted. It shaped your understanding of what sustainable service looks like. Leadership without ego does not ask you to disappear. It asks you to be present in a way that is honest, resourced, and grounded. It asks you to serve without erasing yourself, to give without depleting, to lead without dominating. This is not a lesser form of leadership. It is a deeper one. You were never meant to carry this frequency through force. You were meant to carry it through steadiness, through balance, through care for yourself as much as for others. Because the most reliable service comes from those who remain whole while offering what they have. This is not selfishness. This is wisdom earned through experience. And it is the only kind of leadership that can endure, not stepping forward, but standing true. If something inside you has grown quieter while listening to these words, that stillness is not the result of motivation or excitement. It is recognition. A very old part of you has felt seen, not because you were told something new, but because something familiar has been named without force. This kind of recognition does not rush through the body. It settles. It softens the shoulders. It slows the breath. It brings a sense of being exactly where you are meant to be. Even if your mind has spent years questioning that truth, you are not late. You have not been forgotten. You are not standing in the wrong place. Every season of silence, every stretch of waiting, every moment of being misunderstood has been shaping you with quiet precision. None of it was wasted. None of it was accidental. These experiences were not meant to push you forward faster, but to deepen the way you stand. There is a subtle difference between stepping up and standing true, and most of the world does not recognize it. Stepping up is often driven by comparison, urgency, or the need to prove readiness. Standing true emerges when there is no longer a need to prove anything at all. It comes from alignment rather than ambition. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply holds. You have been taught, slowly and sometimes painfully, that effort alone does not create coherence. You learned that pushing forward without alignment only leads to exhaustion, and that movement born from fear requires constant maintenance. In contrast, movement that arises from peace carries its own support. It does not ask you to strain or convince. It unfolds naturally, like a river that stops fighting its direction and finally allows gravity to do its work. This is why you are not being asked to do more right now. Doing more from the same place would only repeat old patterns. What is being asked of you is subtler and far more powerful. You are being asked to stand differently, to think differently, to respond from calm rather than react from fear, to allow clarity to guide action instead of anxiety. Standing differently does not mean withdrawing from life or responsibilities. It means engaging without losing yourself. It means letting go of the belief that urgency equals importance. It means trusting that alignment is more effective than force. When you stand this way, your presence becomes stabilizing rather than performative. People may not always understand what you are doing, but they will feel the difference. You may have noticed that the drive to prove yourself has softened, that the hunger for recognition has lost its edge, that you are less interested in convincing others and more interested in remaining honest with yourself. This is not apathy, it is maturity. It is the natural result of an inner authority that no longer needs external confirmation to function. Leadership begins here, long before it takes any visible form. It begins in the way you meet uncertainty without collapsing, in the way you hold complexity without simplifying it into slogans, in the way you allow others to be where they are without trying to fix them. These capacities do not develop through ambition. They develop through presence. You may still have moments of doubt. That is human. Doubt does not disqualify you. It keeps you humble. What matters is that doubt no longer drives you into action prematurely. You have learned to wait without resentment, to listen without needing immediate answers, to trust timing without demanding evidence. This trust did not come easily. It was earned through experience. The path you have walked may not look impressive by conventional standards. It may not come with obvious milestones or visible success, but it has given you something far more durable. It has given you steadiness, and steadiness is rare. It is what allows you to remain grounded when others panic, to remain open when others close, to remain present when others retreat into control or distraction. There is a quiet relief that comes when you stop trying to become someone else and allow yourself to be who you already are. You may feel it now, beneath the layers of expectation and effort. It is not excitement, it is ease. A sense that you no longer need to run toward a future version of yourself, because you are already carrying what you need. You are not here to transform into something extraordinary. You are here to return to what has always been true. The frequency you carry was never acquired. It was remembered. It has been refining itself through every challenge, every loss, every pause. What once felt like delay was alignment deepening. What once felt like isolation was inner authority forming. As alignment settles, movement will come, not as pressure, not as urgency, not as performance. It will arrive as a natural next step that feels obvious rather than dramatic. You will recognize it not by excitement, but by calm certainty. It will not ask you to abandon yourself or override your limits. It will feel sustainable, grounded, and true. When this movement begins, you will not need to explain yourself or justify your pace. Those who resonate will recognize you without effort. Those who do not will simply move in different directions. You will no longer feel compelled to manage perception or seek approval. Your energy will speak before your words. You may also notice that leadership no longer feels like a role to step into. It feels like an extension of how you live. It shows up in how you listen, how you pause, how you respond, how you care for your own nervous system as much as for others. This kind of leadership does not exhaust you, because it is not something you perform. It is something you embody. Standing true also means accepting that not everyone will understand your path. Some will misinterpret your quiet as hesitation. Some will mistake your restraint for lack of confidence. This is not your burden to correct. Clarity does not require universal agreement. It requires internal consistency, and you have cultivated that through years of unseen work. As you settle into this understanding, you may feel a gentle permission to stop striving, to stop measuring, to stop rushing. Not because life is over, but because you no longer need to chase meaning. Meaning reveals itself when you are present enough to notice it. You are not becoming someone new. You are not climbing toward a higher version of yourself. You are returning to your original alignment, the one that existed before fear taught you to doubt it, before pressure taught you to override it, before comparison taught you to chase what was never yours. This return is not dramatic. It is simple. It feels like exhaling after holding your breath for a very long time. It feels like standing with your feet firmly on the ground and realizing you do not need to move to be effective. From this place, whatever comes next will be honest. It will not require force. It will not demand self-sacrifice. It will not ask you to betray your body or your truth. It will grow from coherence. And coherence is what sustains impact over time. You are not late. You are not lost. You are not waiting for permission. You are already standing in the right place. The only invitation now is to remain there, to trust what has been built, to allow life to respond to alignment rather than effort, and to remember, gently and without urgency, that what you are here to offer has never depended on becoming more. It has always depended on standing true.